Good afternoon. I want to thank everybody who joins us. My name is Oleksandr, and it's my pleasure to welcome you at Ukrainian Media Center. Today we have invited you to discuss the preparation to the heating season by the local authorities. We will discuss the challenges, the problems, and obviously the solutions to them. And joining us in the studio is Oleksandr Slobozhan, Executive Director of the Association of Ukrainian Cities. Hello, Mr. Oleksandr. Hello. Thank you for invitation. So there is a lot of discussions of this topic. Obviously, us and every other region is preparing to the heating season, given the challenges that we were facing during the last winter. So let's discuss the process of preparation. What do you see, and are the regions being prepared to the upcoming heating season? We've seen some news, a lot of discussions of this topic, and for example, according to the statements of the head of the state, not all of the regions and not all of the towns are being prepared to this season equally. We've seen there are some blamings on some regions. So what's your expertise? What have you been able to identify? Well, first of all, thank you for touching upon this topic, drawing everyone's attention to this topic, because it's quite rarely when I start my speeches from the words of appreciation. I would like to thank all of the team of the Ukraine Media Center, everyone who was listening to us a couple of months ago when we were present here and when it was real cold outside. I would like to thank all of the journalists and just common citizens who were right into the studio. And let me explain why. In this studio a couple of months ago, we were talking about the critical challenges where the heat supply could have stopped. And I was talking about the gas limitations, the relevant resolutions of the government, and it was a critical problem when different communities, different Hromadas reported that they ran out of gas and they just couldn't ensure the proper supply for the hospitals, kindergartens, schools, and other infrastructural installations. And thanks to this publicity, the resolution of the Cabinet of Ministers was changed, relevant calculations were made. And let me remind, for those who were not watching us back then, the problem was that the limits for the budget institutions, the limits for gas and for the population, were set at the level of contingent indicators within the last 3 winters. And the previous 3 winters were way warmer than the last winter that we experienced. And it's clear that due to the low temperature regime, some entities ran out of gas like 15%, 20% earlier, and it was a critical situation that existed back then, and it could have remained until this heating season, because based on those bylaws, every single business, every budget institution, they have to prepare the system to ensure the uninterrupted heat supply, and we were able to change it. That's a very important nuance. Another important nuance for every single one of us, because we are all the consumers, is to ensure the subsidized prices for heat supply. The local authorities try to hold back the heat supply tariffs starting from 2025. The gas transportation prices have grown, POL prices have grown, the gas itself price has grown, so they were growing gradually within the last couple of years. Also, the minimal wages have grown, and what we experience is the deficit of personnel. And another problem we were discussing is the booking of high-tech specialists who ensure the stability or stable operation of the critical infrastructure of the heat supply, gas supply, water supply companies. Those are the people who, after any strike, set out on a mission to mitigate the consequences, and every second that we're sitting without heat supply under strike, every minute is critical for us. And when we have no people to mitigate the consequences of such strikes, well, such mitigation may take weeks, months, and we've solved this problem by amending relevant resolution and ensuring uninterrupted operation of those utility companies. There are still chronic problems remaining. I would call them chronic when it comes to preparation to every heating season, but they are complemented by the new ones. And again, I would like to thank the media center team, the journalists, because your colleagues came to Cherkasy making footages, I would say, difficult reports. I would say those were beautiful reports about difficult situations. I'm talking about cogeneration. So what is the problem that we started having from the 1st of April? According to the resolution of the government, cogeneration is de facto blocked. From the first persons in the state, we keep hearing, like, please develop cogeneration. And instead of easing that, the Association of Ukrainian Cities were discussing since the moment that our partners made the funds available for us for procurement of relevant equipment, for example. And probably you could have heard in the mass media that this cogeneration plant was presented to a Hromada, but it was not commissioned. That's a chronic problem. But what is the problem? Because at the level of the government, at the level of the central executive authorities, the procedures were not simplified that were in effect before the big war. And obviously during the war, it's quite logical to simplify them, to commission those plants, but the majority of the Hromadas cannot get them commissioned because the conditions are such that if you have indebtedness for the gas dating back to the 20th years, well, it's just inadequate because the Hromadas keep holding back the tariffs for the population, and the state did not compensate those tariffs for them. Even for this heating season, this amount reaches 72 billion hryvnia. So you're a company, you're providing the service, you're not being compensated the cost of the service. You cannot pay salaries, you don't have money to pay salaries, to pay your bills, and you end up on the brink of bankruptcy. The licensing conditions are not simplified. The amount of bureaucratic documentation, if we take a look at this small table in front of us, the Hromadas need to prepare this high pile of papers, and it takes about half a year to coordinate all that. But since the 1st of January, the new resolution of the government was adopted that even for those Hromadas who were able to commission the cogeneration plants, for example, in Cherkasy, they're self-sustainable, they generate heat and electricity, they were prohibited to buy gas for cogeneration. This is explicitly set forth in the resolution, and it says that only 10 oblasts, if they fulfill the conditions, can use cogeneration. De facto, we've made a survey, and none of the Hromadas, even from the oblasts that are in the area of active combat operations, they cannot use actually those cogeneration plants. And the mayor of Cherkasy appealed the minister. We've prepared an address to the minister, and we want to draw public attention to this matter. when near Cherkasy, the journalists from all of Ukraine started writing, it's a paradox, it's absurd. You're talking about the development of cogeneration, but at the same time, you block this opportunity for those who've installed that cogeneration, and you don't provide any new opportunities for the others. That's the first challenge when it comes to cogeneration, because it's divided generation. It's an opportunity to avoid, after significant strikes, avoid those periods of the long mitigation of the strikes. It's about stability of the system of the critical companies, heat supply and water supply companies, and it remains the biggest problem until now. Another problem emerged on the 16th and 18th of April. All of our armadas received the lucky letters. I'm probably quoting the Prime Minister, who said it during her meeting with the mayors. Like, why did you send out the letters? She was asking from the head of Naftogaz. Everybody was confident they would be disconnected from gas, and some of the armadas started being disconnected, like Ivano-Frankivsk, Starokonstantinov, in Khmelnytsk region, Cherkasy. Starokonstantinov is a hero city. It's absurd to get them disconnected from life support systems when they end up under crazy strikes almost on a weekly basis. So the oblast units sent out those letters to the armadas telling them to disconnect, and they blocked the accounts of 62 companies through the court resolutions. So imagine you have all of your cars blocked, and you got deprived of all of the funds available to you, all of the cash. So how can you prepare to the heating season? You're not going to be able to do anything, and you're being told you have to buy this, that, and that in the shop, cook some food, and lay the table. So this is the situation we're having. Instead of preparing technically to the heating season, we are in course of a court proceedings with Naftogaz to get our accounts unblocked. But why are the local authorities right in this case? Because they've been brought to the court. They get disconnected from the gas. They get their accounts blocked because of the indebtedness before Naftogaz, which was created because the government didn't allocate the money for those companies to compensate the difference in tariffs. So mayors, the representatives of utility companies hold back the tariffs so they don't skyrocket, as some people demand that we have to pay thousands, $2,000-$3,000 per month, which would be an economically reasonable tariff. And the law 2479 explicitly says that this government must compensate the local authorities for holding back the tariffs. The government is obliged to provide a quick compensation for mitigation of any consequences of any strike on the CHP, water supply companies, and other utility companies. But this problem is several years old. It dates back to year 2021, and we were approaching its solution. There was consensus at the level of central authority. The president 5 times, for what I remember, was appealing the government, was appealing the parliament, was addressing the heads of the relevant ministries, and nothing happened. But I'm not sure that we will be able to prepare to the heating season. People will just retire. I was talking to a lot of the leaders in Lusk. There was a big forum. Those are the technical people. They rarely gather for some forums, but they're desperate. They gathered and they say, let us hand over the keys and all of the documentation from our companies to Naftogaz and let them prepare to the heating season. We cannot work otherwise. How can you work if you have your accounts blocked? You cannot go to mitigate the consequences of the strike. You cannot procure POL, you cannot pay salaries, you cannot buy gas from Naftogaz to ensure the gas supply. And that cogeneration plant that you were presented by European or American partners, you cannot commission it. You've spent a lot of time. Some of the hromadas spent year of time to commission those cogeneration plants. In some hromadas, the residents were pitching in to commission those plants, but now you're being told, like, preserve this cogeneration plant. And we hope that winter is never coming. It's gonna be warm all the time. And hence another question. The situation is similar with the water supply. Heat is being created when water is being heated. I apologize for saying things this elementary. If the pumps at the water supply companies will be off, no matter how much gas you procure, even despite all of the resistance of Naftogaz, still the budget institutions, the residents, will have no heat supply. And it all happens with the backdrop of unsolved problems. So first is the rescinding of a resolution of the government that prohibits cogeneration in Ukraine. It's prohibited. It has been prohibited since the 1st of April. Then unblocking of all of the accounts of all of the utility companies. For the time of war, they should be unblocked because we're talking about the critical infrastructure here. In other countries of the world, even without the war, no one can do this to critical infrastructure with heat and water supply for the residents. That's like a criminal responsibility. In our opinion, it's just a crime to block the accounts and to press on the hromadas through the courts. We understand that monopolists have a large army of lawyers. We understand that their monthly bonuses reach million to 3 million hryvnia, and they can, with such an inspiration for small Starokonstantinov, Uman, Khmelnytsk, Ivano-Frankivsk, who don't pay salaries those that high as in Naftogaz, they cannot hire 80 lawyers who would work on blocking those accounts. So first of all, to rescind the resolution of the Cabinet of Ministers about prohibition of cogeneration. Second, during the martial law, to make it a law that the accounts of the critical infrastructure cannot be blocked and unblock them immediately. Third, to repay the debt that was created during the last years. So we're not talking about the real funds here, how those debts are being accrued. In the year 2021, Starokonstantinov, for example, when the tariffs were being held back, 15 million hryvnia were allocated for them. They had to automatically pay those 15 million hryvnia to Naftogaz. The government pays them and they pay to Naftogaz. Now, the debt amounts to 250-something million. How was it created? So every day of failure to repay those 15 million, because they're saying, like, I expect the government to repay me, so there is a penalty being accrued on those 15 million. And where do they go? For example, during one meeting with the specialist of the region, with the specialist of Naftogaz, we were reviewing this situation and we say, okay, there are 120 billion hryvnia due to use, so let's cut away the additional costs. And they say, like, 13 billion are the legal expenses, 40 million are penalties, and some other amounts are the bonuses to the lawyers. So the real indebtedness is like 20 billion hryvnia, and the government can do the offset by issuing a resolution saying, like, Starokonstantinov, we owe you, you owe Naftogaz. So in this case, no one owes anybody anything, because NAK Naftogaz is our company. It's not a private company. It's a state-owned joint stock company created by the government. We've elected the parliament who appointed the government, and as a residents of Ukraine, we expect Naftogaz to work in our interests, not in the interest of the bonuses for the supervisory boards and the lawyers I don't know who makes those million hryvnia salaries per month, but I think if they cut their personnel, they could fund the indebtedness over small towns and put a placard like the debt was spent at the expense of this or that expert, but still they want to suck all of those companies dry so that they stop and no one can buy gas. And there is another fourth nuance, not less important. And why am I so emotional saying this? Because when you read in the Telegram channels that the people pay for heat supply, but those funds are not being channeled for procurement of the gas, open the resolution number 812 of the government of Ukraine. So every hryvnia that we pay, 65 kopecks from that amount go to the accounts of Naftogaz automatically. Those 35 kopecks from every hryvnia a person pays for heat that are being operated by the utility companies, what should they pay first of all? The taxes and levies that have grown within this period. Then what we pay? We pay for gas transportation. It's a standalone service. Then for POL, for water, and we don't even have enough money left to pay salaries. So I want every citizen to know that your funds go directly to Naftogaz. They don't go to those companies, to those workers who mitigate the consequences of the strikes, of those companies who ensure the uninterrupted heat and power and water supply for you. So if this resolution 812 will not be amended, the heating season will be again an act of heroism, and we will spend more time without heat supply, without power and water supply, honestly, because the majority of the companies will be unable to operate. That's when it comes to urgent problems. Now you've touched upon the plans of resilience. In March 2026, the National Security and Defense Council approved the documents, the plans of resilience of the regions and towns, and I would like to emphasize that they are signed by the representatives of local military administrations. The majority of those documents are classified, so I'm not going to talk a lot about them, but putting it in simple words, those are the documents that contemplate a number of activities aimed at protection of critical infrastructure in the conditions of the war and to ensure their stable operation. And those four problems that I've mentioned, they are definitive for implementation of the resilience plans, because if the resilience plan says that this or that heat supply company should be ensured uninterrupted heat supply, the physical protection, the responsibility for the physical protection is vested in the military administration. And if it was not fortified against strikes, and if a cogeneration plant will be prohibited and it will just be sitting there, if a company will have the accounts blocked and it will not be operating, it will be just a pile of metal. And it will be impossible to say that any point of the resilience plan, any article of the resilience plan could be fulfilled. Another thing about the resilience plans, the indicators by which we could evaluate that this region or this hromada respectively fulfilled the plan in advance or according to the terms is failing to fulfill the plan is impossible because we don't have clear indicators. And in this slide is yet another important block of this evaluation. I'm asking you to buy me a pack of milk at the shop, but at the same time I'm saying like I'm gonna give you money for that, and to buy that money you wait for me to give you money. To buy that milk you wait for me to give you money, And a lot of the resilience plans in the regions are tied to the funding from the government. So they are supposed to fulfill some activity, and then the military administration needs to launch a following phase. And in the majority of the cases, the government didn't fulfill those activities to make sure that Dnipropetrovsk, Kharkiv, Chernihiv, Kiev, and other military administrations could proceed to the second phase to move forward to fulfill their resilience plans. They're still waiting because the government said, we've allocated some funds. And a week ago, I was asking the Hromadas, did you get the money from the government? And there was no even a confirmation. But there is already evaluation that given those funds provided to you, you had to fulfill this, that, and that. So there is a sequence of activities. With those resilience plans, there is another important issue that needs to be discussed openly and honestly. There is a deficit of financial resources in the country. I'm not going to criticize the government or say like there are some primary urgent expenses. Like for us, the preparation to the heating season is the priority. For the representatives of other sector, other things are priority. And it makes their reserve when it comes to grants to the humanitarian aid is exhausted, but their credit resources are cheaper and longer. For example, if our banks propose higher interest rate for the loans for 3 years, the Americans, the Europeans, other foreign partners propose a rate which is twice or thrice lower for the period starting from 5 to 10 to 15 years. The longer the period, the easier it is for the Hromadas to return those funds. And we're saying to the government, like, we're not asking you to take those loans. We understand that you spend a lot for the sector of defense. You have a lot of debts yourself, but we have beautiful changes in the budget code that were supported by our foreign partners. And us as the Association of Ukrainian Cities, we have already developed the methodology, the algorithm of cooperation with the American, with the European banks, and such communities as such Hromadas as Dnipro and Lviv, even smaller Hromadas, Priutivsk, in the Kirovohrad Oblast, they have been working with those loans for a long time. Kharkiv, Odessa, Zaporizhia as well, and now we have an opportunity open for even the smaller Hromadas to work with those financial resources. We only ask them, like, adhere to the legislation. Don't block those tools. And it's not a question to the government. I'll give you an example. The city of Kyiv raised loan resources even despite having an extensive budget. From that budget, 100 billion are 70 billion are expenses for the budget sphere, like salaries to the teachers, to the social workers. So those are transit money. You cannot influence them. To secure Kiev, you need 300 billion. 300 billion to prepare the critical infrastructure. They're not going to emerge in either Kiev or state budget ever. That's why they entered into a loan agreement for 20-25 years, and foreign partners fund the reconstruction of relevant installations. What does the law enforcement system do? They read some scientific work where some scientists said that living in debt is bad, taking loans is bad, and they initiate a criminal proceeding against a representative of a financial department of a Kiev municipal administration for signing the documents. But if we look at the documents, they were approved by the Ministry of Finance. It's signed by the deputy minister because it's a local borrowing. National regulator, National Commission for Securities. It was voted in by the Kiev Municipal Council. They went through all of the checks. The guarantor is the state, Kiev Municipal State Administration, national regulator. The interest is being paid, and they start a criminal case, and we are being addressed as an Association of Ukrainian Cities by 10 hromadas, and they said that our deputies and our colleagues are afraid to work with EAB or EBRD because if there is such an approach that a criminal case was initiated for taking loans, we're not going to convince anybody that it's okay, and we will better ask the government, like, give us the money, and if they don't, then they are guilty. So it's not the right approach to this situation. I think that the top level officials should make a statement. We prohibit such things, and we give a green light for the local borrowings, for the raising of credit funds, because we don't have sufficient money. Let the local authorities, in coordination with the Ministry of Finance, with the state regulators, take those loans. This is what's written in the budget code. It was copied from the budget legislation of the European countries and America, who have been living many years in a situation like this, making use of the financial markets, and it's only so that we will be able to fulfill the resilience plans. Our deadline is until the 1st of September, and I'll be honest with you, all of the steps will not be fulfilled until those 4 problems will be solved: deblocking the accounts, repayment of debt, rescinding of the enforcement of funds by Naftogaz for payment of services, the launching of the market of the local borrowings, and number 5, the unblocking of opportunity to work with cogeneration. Thank you, Mr. Oleksandr, for information. There was a lot of critics of Naftogaz. I'm confident that should we have a representative of Naftogaz here, they would tell us how many documents they have that oblige them to bring the cases to the court in case of existing indebtedness. So I'm getting an impression that it's really a matter that should be discussed on the level above by the government, that should be solved. Do you agree with this? Because I'm confident that the state company has such documents that oblige them to bring the cases to the court in case of indebtedness. Well, you know that there is law and there is the spirit of law. If Naftogaz would initiate it with the president or with the government, like, we're put in the conditions when we need to bring the case to the court. So please make an amendment. We've prepared it, and I'll tell you even more, that amendment that was suggested by us in coordination with the Ministry of Development of Hromadas and Territories, that was supported by all of the people's deputies. It was blocked by Naftogaz, explaining that our people need to get bonuses. So you're right. One thing is when you are being required to do something, but as a statesperson, you're not getting concerned about some specific community, but there is such an expression: the client is always right. And if Starokonstantinov, a utility company, shuts down in Starokonstantinov, in Cherkasy, Naftogaz will have to cut their personnel one way or another, no matter how many cases they win in the courts. Okay, they win 255 million, and the payment will take 20 years, but in year 26, the companies will shut down, the utility companies, and they will be getting payments for 20 years, and Naftogaz will have nobody to sell their services to. That's one important thing. And second thing, we are being watched by the regular, like, spectators who had practice of working with the courts. So you can do it in a different ways. The first thing you can do, protecting your customers, protecting your consumers, because the population and the heat and water supply companies are the customers of Naftogaz, and they should be created such conditions. You should come up with such an initiative. If you see that the situation is absurd and you will be required, the law enforcement will come to you and say that you didn't bring the case to the court. You have to become public, become outspoken, saying that I care about you as a representative of Naftogaz. I care about you as my customers. And the law enforcement agencies require me to do this and that. I'm not caring about some specific person. If Kyiv, Lviv, Dnipro don't get loans because people are afraid to work with the IFIs, we will be freezing. And the head of Naftogaz would be supposed to initiate it, and the president would listen to them. But the situation is different. They say, like, they're bad, they have debts, and I have to pay bonuses to my colleagues, and it creates a rift to the society. Everybody who looks at their bills look at their salaries, and then they publish declarations of those workers of Naftogaz, and they say, well, probably it's difficult to survive for 1 million per month, but we're making it somehow. And you know, 10 employees of Naftogaz, their bonuses cover the heat supply for a small Hromada for a year, well, covering themselves with the formal reasons, like we are being required to enforce the indebtedness. Well, it's a whole different question. In those Hromadas, they don't have legal services. In fact, all those things, by recourse, should be brought to the courts against government. And when it comes to formal documents, Naftogaz should bring the government of Ukraine to the court, but they're afraid of the government and they know they're not gonna win. That's why they bring those most unprotected, the residents of the Hromadas, and respectively the small Hromadas, or the Hromadas in which the critical situation, such as in Starokonstantinov, is such that they don't have time for court proceedings. They have to ensure the operation of the Hromadas. So what you're saying is partially true. We have to discuss it. Yes, there is a bureaucratic requirement to bring the cases to the court, but our suggestion in year 2022 was, like, again, it was submitted by all of the people's deputies from representing all of the political forces. They submitted the amendment to prohibit blocking the accounts until the end of the war and until the repayment of the difference by the government. Do not enforce that indebtedness from the utility companies. It could be a law unless it's blocked. I told you who blocked it. You can verify my words, but it never happened. And they say we have formal reasons to do so. Well, you know, it's not an approach of a person, like a person who doesn't get salary. They may tell the residents, like, I'm not going to mitigate the consequences, I'm not getting my salary. Well, thank you for this information. I would like to discuss another legislative initiative. In May, additional funds will be allocated to reinforce the energy efficiency of the buildings and to provide more tools to the Hromadas. The legislation, the Act 6319, is being discussed. What do you think about that draft law? Can it facilitate the process of preparation? No, it's not gonna do anything. It's a very formal. No representatives of the utility companies were involved in the development of this draft legislation. It contains a number of good declarations. But you know, there is a joke like, can you stop a train? Yeah, train, please stop. So no matter what's written in the draft, even if it's adopted as a law without this financial component and without cancellation of those government things, no energy efficiency can work. I can tell you right away that when we talk to the managers with the heads of the unions of residents, we see that they cannot even raise the funds that they find, because it's not regulated by the law. But this draft is declarative. It says the right things, that we should switch, but those regular things that concern the leads of the unions of residents, how to register the accounts, how to make sure that you retain those 65% that are being taken by Naftogaz. So if you take a loan to buy a big generator so that you can repay that loan, so that you get this loan quickly extended to you, so that you don't get brought to the court as the head of the union of residents, because many people will be just afraid to work in that case because they felt protected when the Ministry of Finance signed under those documents, when the national regulator signs. So, even things that were planned good, again, to solve the problem, it's not sufficient to adopt this or that legislation. First of all, the law needs to correspond to the problems it needs to regulate, and the practice of implementation of this law should be proper so that no one violates that law. Let me give you an example. In 2022, in July, the parliament approved a beautiful law, 2479, that was describing the energy efficiency. In Article 2, it was saying that the state needs to compensate the difference in tariffs and the consequences of the attacks by Russian Federation. So 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, the government and Naftogaz don't comply with that law. So getting back to your question, in this part, they're not afraid of law enforcement. They don't bring anything to the court. Naftogaz doesn't bring government to the court saying they should compensate. But when it comes to smaller hromadas, they are afraid of the law enforcement, and they bring those cases to the court. And respectively, the statistics is different. When you have 1,476 hromadas multiplied by 5 utility companies, well, the statistics of criminal cases is extensive. And on the other hand, you have government and Naftogaz, only one entity, which deteriorates the statistics. And if you allow me, I started with the words of gratitude and appreciation. And when you asked whether they signed it or not, let me read you one document. A joint limited liability company, Naftogaz Trading, the affiliate in Cherkasy, the copy to utility company of Cherkasy, a notification on revocation of order on cutting of gas supply. So there was an order issued to block the accounts and disconnect the gas. You've made it public. You've made a report. You've demonstrated the number of cogeneration plants. The residents of Cherkasy told your journalists how they survived the winter, and if it all stops, they would not survive another winter. And the order was immediately revoked. Why did they want to demonstrate it? It's a statesman approach, but they just got scared because the topic was given publicity, and it was explained very simply, like, solve it in a different way. Don't bring it to the court. Don't issue orders to disconnect the gas. Find a compromise with the Hromada. So there is a solution if there is a will to do it. Yeah, we have an example of Cherkasy, but the mass media is called the fourth authority for a reason. When 3 branches were unable to solve the problems of Cherkasy residents, when they had to cut the water, gas, and heat supply, many people in utility companies had to be fired. Good job of the journalists. The clarification of the things, who needs to do what, who failed to do what, how it should be done. I didn't accuse anybody when I was talking. I was saying that We need to act in a statesmanship way in order to survive the heating season. And if the heat supply companies will be shut down, not them who will be suffering, it will be us. The employees will be fired. We will be without heat, but even Naftogaz will suffer because no one is going to buy gas from them, and they will have to cut their personnel or just shut down, because otherwise whom are they going to sell their gas to? The industry is all bombed. All of this researches show that we are number one in terms of consumption. The utility sector during the big war is a number one consumer, because a lot of business companies, a lot of industries that were procuring a lot of gas are either destroyed or occupied. Let's talk about it honestly. The population buys the majority of the gas, as well as utility sector. Mr. Oleksandr, before we finish, I would like to touch upon yet another topic and ask you about the reconstruction of our energy infrastructure, about the construction of underground storages for substations and other physical protection measures. But after what we've heard from you, it seems like the things are not moving because of those barriers that you've mentioned. Or isn't that so? Don't all of our regions have this kind of problem? Well, first of all, thank you for this question. We're not going to discuss it in detail because it's closed information, but it draws a straight boundary between the problems. The matter of physical protection is a question to the regional military administrations and central authorities. Our role as local authorities is to ensure co-funding of those activities, to ensure the so-called technological cars documentation in order not to disclose it. There is an analytical component, so to say, because the central authorities in specific communities, in cooperation with the local authorities, without contribution of that specific community, would not be able to protect those installations. So in this case, we have positive shifts. We have quite a good coordination in this area, and I really appreciate the fact that the representatives of the reconstruction agency, like Mr. Sukhamlin, take the best suggestions from the Hromadas, for example, Zaporizhia, Kharkiv, Chernihiv, Sumy, Dnipropetrovsk, the Oblast, and the city of Dnipro, and I would also add Pavlograd, Nikopol, Kryvyi Rih, and they help them to implement those things. It's mostly costly in terms of financial resources, technologies, and human resources. Is when it comes to those regions that I've mentioned. Talking about the western part of Ukraine, the central government supports it a lot. The Hromadas identified for themselves that, for example, this is the installation on which not only one but all of the Hromadas in the oblast depend. So I'm not going to disclose what kind of installation is that, but in Burштyn there was a catastrophe. Thanks God, Ukraine didn't feel it. The state regional administration didn't allocate any funds to Burштyn due to objective reasons. The government, first of all, allocated funds to Kharkiv, Chernihiv, Sumy, and Kremenchuk. That was objective again. Everybody understands it. So what have we done? We could criticize the central government. When we were told, like, we're ready to help you, we, as Association of Ukrainian Cities, we've initiated a fundraiser, and all of the Hromadas in Ivano-Frankivsk region, not a lot, but there was a requirement like pitching as much as you can. The city of Kiev allocated 10 million. then the government allocated 200 million. But talking about the stages, during the first stage, they couldn't do anything. And when we covered the first stage using the small amounts, we switched to the second phase, and the system started functioning. And when it comes to the physical protection, I'm more optimistic, when it comes to coordination between cooperation, and when it comes to those best developments, the best ideas of the local municipalities to be adopted by the Ministry of Development and military administrations, everything that can be done without money, everything that can be done without long process of coordination and agreements, without those court proceedings with Naftogaz. All of those things are being fulfilled and implemented, and we work with the communities relevantly. So we have to separate these two problems. Even in the resilience plans, they are separated. But thank you for paying attention to this matter. But in the summer, those are the reserves that can be done before summer. In summer, we're coming to that limit when some of the articles of the resilience plan would not be able to be fulfilled without the solution of those 5 systemic problems. And I'm giving you the example of Cherkasy to ensure physical protection there, to make sure the residents are not getting left without heat and power supply, because the power supply is tied to cogeneration. Well, after that, we can rescind that resolution. Thank you for covering those problems who really need solution within the shortest period. Thank you for the spectators and listeners, and I would like to thank our security and defense forces, thanks to whom we can discuss important things. Thanks, everybody. Glory to Ukraine. Glory to the heroes.